I would now like to introduce our speaker for this hour. His name is George Szamuely, and he was born in Hungary in 1954 and is a writer and columnist for such publications as Counterpunch, antiwar.com, and the Observer. He is currently a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute and has been highly critical of the United Nations tribunals, particularly the one on Yugoslavia. He wrote a book called Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. And he argues that the UN and certain human rights groups serve the interests of Western powers to foment and maintain conflict. So I bring you right now, George Szamuely. Welcome, George. This is your first Unity for J vigil.
Yes.
How did you find out about the vigil? How did you come to the program of Julian Assange and Wikileaks, the persecution that they're undergoing?
Well, it's been a shocking thing to witness for a number of years now. The unremitting campaign of vitriol and hatred toward an organization that is dedicated to nothing other than to keep the public informed. I mean, this is an organization is dedicated to publishing information that is vital to have an informed citizenry. Information about the things that the citizenry government does. And what has been the response of much of the media? Total hostility. And this really is extraordinarily revealing about the state of the media and the state of our culture, that something like this is, which every journalist should be applauding, celebrating, is actually attacking. And that somebody like Julian Assange, who's really the poster boy for free information, free speech, a poster boy is instead continually under attack and of a very personal nature. So it's understandable that governments want to get him. Yes, he's providing information governments don't want, out in the open. But what is shocking is that the people who should be the consumers of this information, that they are leading the charge against this man. And this is what really, got me very involved, very angry, and very emotional about this. And so that's how I've come to this Unity for J.
Thank you. And your colleagues at the Global Policy Institute, do you feel that they have the same thoughts? Do you discuss it? And not just with that organization, but your general colleagues in general. What are you feeling? Is there momentum, or are you somewhat isolated on this?
Well, I think as far as the kind of the mainstream academia, mainstream media, yeah, there I think I am rather isolated. Mainstream academia is very, particularly in the United Kingdom, but it's very heavily dependent on government, and they really don't want to stick their necks out and do anything at all that might call into question the large dollops of money that they get from government. So, the universities in general are rather quiescent and don't want to rock the boat because they might just lose all those millions of dollars, or in the millions of pounds in the UK that they need. So they really want to keep a very low profile, and given the government's attitude towards Julian Assange, mainstream academia is not going to stick its neck out.
Well, how do you feel for your own career safety?
Well, I think it's one of those things that it's not great for one's career. I mean, it's in the kind of mainstream kind of career. You're always under threat, and you just have to really dedicate yourself to what you think is true, what you think is just, what you think is fair, and whatever sacrifices you or I or anybody else makes, it is nothing in comparison with the sacrifices that Julian Assange has made, because he really has sacrificed his own life for this. And so, I mean, you think, well, I have it bad, but just think of what he has had to endure. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, really, you even think about this.
Have you been doing any of your writing around Julian Assange, or do you have any written works you plan to put out there for the public?
Yes, I have. I do. I've been working on the origins of the new Cold War. And for that work, I've been heavily reliant on particularly the Wikileaks Cables, which is a fascinating insight into the sort of the public figures who shaped the new Cold War. And much of what the information that you get there is contrary to the official version that you receive from policymakers, denizens of think tanks, mainstream media, of U.S. officialdom that went out of its way to be as friendly and as cooperative toward post-communist Russia as possible, and that it was only the mean and nasty Russians who were so unreliable and turned against us. The WikiLeaks cables offer us a fascinating insight into what really happened. And I found it an absolute goldmine of information. So yeah, I'm heavily reliant on that. And for that, for that alone, I feel I and many others owe a debt towards Julian. I mean, whatever we can do to repay him for what he has done for us. I mean, that we should try to do.
This new Cold War, it is fascinating because that's exactly what we're in, and accompanied by a neo-McCarthyist climate as well. Just to contextualize it for our viewers, when exactly did the old Cold War end, and what dates, more or less, did this new Cold War begin?
Well, the old Cold War probably ended sometime in 1991. Following the unification of Germany, and then following the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. The new Cold War started almost immediately because the United States, Western powers, immediately did what they said they wouldn't do, which is to exploit the vulnerability of Russia and expand NATO right up to its borders. They did it immediately, despite all of the guarantees that they had issued to Gorbachev in 1990, 1991, that we will not unilaterally take advantage of your moment of vulnerability. So give us everything we want. Yes, sign off on unification of Germany, sign off on the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. We will not take any unilateral advantage. The moment the Warsaw Pact dissolved, they seized on this and to take unilateral advantage. So the Cold War, new Cold War, began almost immediately. It suddenly became more vehement in the recent past. I think when Russia really just turned around and saw what had happened, and then to what extent they've now been pushed into a corner, and to what extent that the Western powers had broken their word to them and had seized their moment of advantage to essentially put them in a militarily vulnerable position. And I think that's when the Western powers really turned with fury against Russia.
Right. I think we can presume that as soon as one Cold War ended, they would be doing the other. But in terms of the public's understanding and the massive propaganda that was coming our way, it, it didn't really ratchet up Cold War 2.0 probably until I think even before the elections, because now it's at a fever pitch. So maybe the question I'm asking is more um, in the public propaganda realm for Cold War
Mm,
2.0.
right.
All that other stuff was definitely happening behind the scenes, always, forever.
Yes.
When do you feel like, and what prompted this more public facing Cold War 2.0 vilification of the Soviets?
Of the Russians.
Sorry, the Russians. Yeah, it's Cold War
Uh,
again. Now they're Russians.
yeah, I think the more recent, I mean, as you say, the point at which the public suddenly became aware of this, I think we can trace that to 2013. In 2013, if you recall, uh, Barack Obama was all set to bomb Syria, again for another one of these, chemical attacks, or would-be chemical attacks, and uh, Russia, with Putin, essentially came to his rescue and said, "Okay, well, we'll get to a unilateral disarmament. We'll unilaterally get rid of Syria will unilaterally get rid of its chemical weapons, and you don't bomb." And that got Obama off the hook because I think Obama didn't want to get involved in yet another Middle East war. He saw what happened to the Bush administration. He didn't want the same thing to happen to him. So he seized on this essentially a very generous offer from Putin. Okay, United States and Russia will oversee the disarmament of Syria, and this took happen. But at that moment, what the United States did was in an act of extraordinary Ukraine and to try to topple the elected legitimate government of Ukraine. And this really caused fury and distress in Russia. I mean, Ukraine and Russia are very close, and the idea that the United States would so blatantly, so explicitly interfere in the domestic affairs of Ukraine to topple an elected government and try to install a kind of a pro-US, pro-NATO regime in Kiev, I think that really just enraged Russia. And so that was February 2014. And from that moment on, there's been enormous tension between the West and Russia. So that, I think, the winter of 2013, 2014 is the real start of this, the Cold War 2.0, which, as far as the public is concerned.
Okay, that's good to know. And I have just been in awe of Putin's measured response. We're practically encircling him left and right, throwing him side punches. Um, how do you account for somebody who is just so restrained? What is keeping him? And before we go there, is it possible for you to fix your camera so that your head is more in the frame?
Like
There,
this.
good. Yes, excellent. Thank you. Yes. So, what do you account for Putin's restraint in the face of such antagonism by the United States?
It's a very good question. I sometimes wonder about it myself. I mean, he's a very restrained, very calm person. He's not one given to losing his temper, banging his fist on the table. And that's why the United States is acting very foolishly in thinking that somehow once they can wait out Putin's term, at some point he will disappear, and then they'll get a friendly government in Moscow, and then everything will be back to the good old days of Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s. Because whoever comes after Putin will probably be a very different type of person. He won't be measured, as you say. He's not going to be calm and restrained and somewhat phlegmatic. I mean, he may be somebody more in the Nikita Khrushchev mold, who's going to take risks, who will get angry, who will, easily lose his temper, start actually explicitly challenging the United States rather than backing away from fights. And so the United States may well come, in 10 years to regret that they didn't work more closely and cooperatively with Vladimir Putin.
That is absolutely true, because we have not seen a leader quite like him, no matter how much they poke and prod him. Did you, by chance, watch the Oliver Stone interviews with Putin?
Yes.
I heard some people say he was just pulling a fast one. Oliver Stone was just beguiled by him, as is the public who halfway believes him. But I was very impressed with his knowledge, his understanding, just the humane quality. I loved seeing him driving a car. We're so surrounded. Our presidents are in this bubble, and he was like a real person going to play hockey or whatever. But the question is, how much of that was sophisticated PR on Putin's part versus just real honesty, and we're not used to it?
I think it was, to be honest, really real honesty, because that's how he is. I mean, I've watched a lot of his performances, a lot of his speeches, a lot of his interviews. That's the way he is. I mean, he's somebody who is rather charming. He has a certain dry wit. He's a little, in fact, very understated. Often, when he's baited, he doesn't take the bait. Extraordinarily polite toward his interviewers, who are often, well, not Oliver Stone, but many interviewers are openly insulting toward him. He's very polite, very measured, very restrained. That's how he always is. And he is, as you say, he's very humane. I mean, yeah, there he is. He's driving a car, playing sports. There's none of this sort of grandeur and pomposity that you get, particularly with American politicians, who go from limo to limo. And I think that's, which is why it's very funny when you come across these ridiculous stories that somehow he's worth $200 billion, he has this huge wealth. Well, where's any evidence that he has some kind of an ostentatious lifestyle? Where's the evidence that he particularly likes money, and enjoys expensive things? None. There's no evidence at all. So so many of these Western stories, which cater to the sort of the mean-spirited Western public, or he's looting the treasury, he's helping himself to other people's money. It's nonsense. You look at him, he's clearly not somebody that's not what interests him. He's not interested in money and material things. I mean, he's interested in making Russia great, which is exactly what any leader of his country is supposed to do. I mean, he's the president of Russia. That's what he's supposed to be doing, trying to make Russia prosperous, successful, and influential.
Right, I agree. It's not like I have Putin or Russia on a pedestal. I'm sure they have their internal machinations that are just as nefarious as what we have going on. And Mark Sloboda, who lives in Russia, was very clear that they're not leftists. But it's very interesting to see in this world right now who is not producing GMO food, who has raised their whole economy in a way that has really helped their people. When I read that in the Soviet Union, if it's true, they actually have very widespread, what would you call it, civil defense in case of a nuclear attack for their people. We've got nothing. So it's not like, oh, now I'm this Russia lover. It's just I'm looking at some of the evidence of their country versus ours and how downhill we've gone, and just how some really good facts and evidence about their country has changed my perspective. And so when I saw the Putin interviews that Oliver Stone did, I was more ready to be open and accepting of him. And I'm glad to hear from you. I'm just not a big gullible lefty or whatever.
Right.
So I
No,
appreciate
and instead, I mean, there is a kind of a discussion program that I always watch, and I have it every evening. It's called Вечер с Владимиром Соловьевым. It's in Russian, and it's a kind of a talk show. But when you watch this, unfortunately, it's all in Russian, and so there's no subtitle. But when you watch this, you realize that the level of the discussion is so much more sophisticated than any kind of discussion you would get on American TV. There isn't people just yelling their talking points. There's a real dialogue. There's a real reflection on world affairs. The people are very well informed, not just about their country, but about the rest of the world. You watch anything on American cable, it's mostly people spouting the talking points that they were provided by. In the case of MSNBC, it's the talking points provided by the Democratic National Committee, and in the case of Fox News, it's the Republicans' talking point. It's a measure of a kind of superiority of a political and media culture that I think is really quite remarkable. Remarkable just how much U.S. debaters decline. I mean, you can actually even see it. You don't even have to watch Russian TV. I mean, you can just watch an interview. You can go to YouTube and watch some interview from, say, 1968 of Gamal Abdel Nasser. I mean, it was on YouTube. It was an interview conducted in 1968 or 69. And you think, you could not get anything like this on television today. Actually, a courteous discussion, questions that are courteous rather than, when did you stop supporting terrorism? Are you still in favor of terrorism? When are you going to accept the state of Israel? I mean, instead of this kind of essentially, mindless slogans, really a thoughtful, intelligent interview. I mean, that's gone. I mean, that's just simply gone from U.S. media.
Right. It is a travesty. And
Yeah.
just how the Russian people, I think, have supported their president says a lot. My brother-in-law was in Russia during the Yeltsin years and saw just poverty, people lying in the streets. It was really bad. Everything that we've been told, it's still alike. But last year he went there and was amazed. He was able to get inexpensive organic food. People were happy. So obviously this is just one person, but he was very shocked at the transition. And that has to be a strong leader who believed in his people and wanted to help his country build up, as opposed to the poverty and the difficulties that we're having as the oligarchs in this country, worldwide, but in this country finally too, stealing up all the copper piping, everything they can get their hands on.
Yes,
Quite a
yes.
big difference.
Huge. It is a huge, and it's a very, very important part of what Russia is about today, which is we don't want to go back to the 1990s. And for that, they also say, well, the West really took a very active part in facilitating the looting of Russia. I mean, this is the looting of Russia. And they, the people who actually said, oh, let's make this quick transition to free market capitalism, they really were responsible for, its key parts of the Russian industry winding up in the hands of the worst kinds of oligarchs. So this was wide-scale looting presided over by Yeltsin and essentially his U.S. government controllers. So the fact that Russia has now moved away from that and said we cannot go, we will never go back to that era. I think that I think riles Westerners, and they just vent their fury. How dare you not want to us to loot your country? How dare you not want us to grab all your oil and gas riches and pocket all the money for ourselves?
Exactly. It's amazing how we think the whole world is our backyard to do with it what
Yeah,
it will.
exactly. And so at that time, so these days when, they use these words like oligarchs, all these oligarchs around Putin. But the fact is that Putin actually got rid of the oligarchs. I mean, he said, who were the oligarchs, which is, all right, I will let you keep your money, but you stay the hell out of politics. That was the deal that he offered. And those who didn't take the deal wound up kicked out of the country or in prison. But that was his deal. It was a very generous deal. So now, again, the Western media, you keep hearing about the oligarchs in Russia, oligarchs in Russia. The oligarchs who were in Russia were oligarchs that were created by the West, through the looting of the 90s. Then what you now have in Russia are rich people, but they don't run policy. They have money, but they basically have to keep out of politics. So the whole idea that these oligarchs, well, those are the very oligarchs that you created, and they're not around anymore.
Right. And all our oligarchs in the West, we've just legalized it. So it's not criminal, it's just legal theft.
That's right.
I'd really like to ask you about your thoughts about NATO and the book you wrote about the bombing on Yugoslavia. Do you see corollaries? Just speak about what NATO has to do with this Cold War 2.0.
Well, it's a very important part of it because NATO is really a kind of a public protection racket. I mean, it's there's no enemy that NATO is supposedly defending anybody against. So what is it actually doing? So it has to create its own crises to justify its existence. So it kind of triggers the very crises. Then it provides provides as claims that it is the solution. So, for instance, as it moves eastward, the Russians get very upset. Then the Russians get upset. So then we got the various kind of the Baltic states, Poland. They start getting very agitated and saying, "Oh no, we need more NATO. We need more NATO protection." NATO then comes up, "Well, yes, we have to move in. There's a huge, dangerous Russian threat looming. We need more resources for NATO." So it becomes like a protection racket, which is, well, nice place you've got here. Shame if anything were to happen to it. So this is how NATO operates. And so, now NATO is much, much bigger than it ever was in the days of the Soviet Union. And what is its purpose? What is it supposedly doing? And under Trump, who supposedly campaigned against NATO, it's now getting even more resources, and it's clearly creating these zones of instability. It's creating zones of instability in the Balkans, and it's creating the zones of instability on Russia's frontiers, in particular in the Baltics, because at some point that these kinds of tensions, these niggling annoyances could explode, because there's a limit to what Russia will tolerate. I mean, Russia's not going to tolerate forever a substantial NATO buildup in the Baltics. I mean, they have to worry about their own security. They won't tolerate forever a kind of a substantial NATO buildup in the Black Sea. So NATO is a great source of instability and danger for the world. Because as long as it just keeps expanding, and it just keeps expanding. I mean, now the latest recruit, Macedonia. So now they're going to try and push Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Serbia and Kosovo and Bosnia into NATO. So it just keeps expanding, and just creating crises along the way. And for instance, let's just look back in 2008. The 2008 crisis in Georgia was entirely created by the Bush administration that pushed NATO into promising NATO membership for Georgia. Because at that moment, the president of Georgia, Saakashvili, said, "Well, hey, I want to get in NATO, but there are certain qualifications that I have to meet, namely that I have to get rid of conflicts within my territory, And that caused him to launch his attack on South Ossetia, which in turn led to Russia intervening. But that was entirely a crisis created by NATO. I mean, there wouldn't have been a crisis if NATO hadn't recklessly promised, NATO membership to Georgia. Same with Ukraine. I mean, the Ukraine crisis was also created by the fact that there was an EU association agreement, which had a very substantial NATO component to it. And this, Ukraine's a very divided country. This, upset quite a lot of people in Ukraine. So it was NATO that kind of triggered a crisis in Ukraine.
Do you think as Europeans move towards Brexit strategies, the Iberian Peninsula, those people want out. Greece, of course, has been just really punished by the European Union. If that ever becomes more successful, where they exit out, would that ipso facto be the fall of NATO, or is NATO now just an appendage of US vassal military might?
Well, that's a very good question, because at the moment, EU is just simply a kind of a rubber stamp for the United States. So, EU just pretty much, NATO are actually, interlocked. But what you kind of wonder, what happens given Trump and the kind of Trumpian hostility towards the EU, and given the sort of various nationalist movements now emerging in Europe against the rule of Angela Merkel, you had to wonder whether there might finally come about, once there's a change of leadership in Europe, finally come about a sense in Europe of genuine independence. I mean, how long can this ridiculous transatlantic relationship continue? I mean, it was set up temporarily because of this huge danger from the Soviet Union in the late 1940s. How long is this going to keep going? It's clearly not in the interests of the Europeans, because they're spending an awful lot of money on military stuff that they don't really need. There's no real threat. The Americans don't seem to be happy. At least Trump doesn't seem to be very happy about what NATO is contributing. So no one seems very happy with it, and yet it just keeps going through kind of an inertia of its own. So you wonder, well, if there's finally, we can get some new leadership in Germany, maybe there'll be some sort of a change within Europe.
Okay. In terms of Cold War 1.0, the original Cold War, one of its hallmarks was Operation Gladio and all these attacks that happened in Brussels, in Italy, with the assassination of Aldo Moro, that kidnapping. How would you characterize Operation Gladio in 2.0? Is there one going on in our Cold War era today? And how's it the same? How's it different?
Well, this kind of thing is something that is very much ongoing, in which you have these crises, and in which it's you have somebody's killed, there's some terrorist incident, and the finger immediately points to somebody else. Oh yeah, it was the communists who did it. It was the left that was responsible. So here we have, for instance, the downing of MH17, which Western media has immediately said it's the Russians. The Russians were behind it. It was they're the ones who, they provided these missiles. No evidence has ever been produced. No evidence. And what's more, what evidence that is at the disposal of the United States and NATO, they've kept hidden. They've never provided any serious information about the tracking the flight of MH17, tracking any missiles in the vicinity, and none of this. They've not, and yet they've absolutely convinced the public, thanks to its pliant media, that the Russians were responsible for the downing of MH17. And so, report after report after report, they would say, oh, it's the Russians were responsible. Yet not one shred of evidence has ever been presented. And so this is sort of an ongoing thing of creating these kind of crises, incidents, and immediately pointing the finger at somebody. I mean, we had this throughout the Yugoslavia. It was a constant thing in Yugoslavia. We'd have bombings in marketplaces, and right away, Western governments say, "Oh, it was the Serbs who were responsible," and the media again just mindlessly write it up. Yep, it was the Serbs responsible. You see this in Syria. I mean, you have chemical attack. Oh, the Syrian government is responsible. No need for any investigation. No need for any evidence. You just simply you use these incidents to point a finger against the adversary of the day.
I would like to do more investigation of WikiLeaks to the extent that they reveal the current Gladio operations.
Yes.
I haven't in the listing, I don't necessarily see many of those that have happened. But now you have been looking closely at a lot of the WikiLeaks files, and they have helped you enormously in figuring out exactly what's going on. To what extent, supposedly, WikiLeaks is 100% accuracy rate. No newspaper publication, especially, of course, the New York Times, can even begin to touch that. Now that you have burrowed into the details of some of these WikiLeaks, what would you say, from your opinion, is there that degree of accuracy that you're finding, or might that be overblown support of WikiLeaks to say that?
I haven't found any inaccuracies. And what is remarkable is that they provide you with the documents as they are. I mean, there they are. You've got the documents. There's nothing, they're not doctored. No one's redacted anything. No one's deleting any information. It's there. Now compare that with the information that the US government releases. I mean, you look at it, page after page after page of redactions. I mean, what is the point of this? I mean, there's just, there's nothing there. I mean, you look at it. Or yesterday, the FBI released a kind of a 70-page document dump about its relationship with Christopher Steele, the author of the dossier. I mean, almost all of it was whited out. I mean, so they get this publicity. The FBI gets this publicity. Well, we believe in open government and in the transmission of information for the public. Yeah, but you whited everything out. I mean, no one knows anything. I mean, anybody can do that. Just here's some blank paper. Make of this what you will. So WikiLeaks has provided us with the actual information. I think has been very bold on the part of Julian Assange. I mean, he has actually insisted on it, that we release the information as is. We don't start the editing and the doctoring and say, well, we've got to protect sources and methods, and we're going to make sure that this person isn't put in a difficult position or whatever, because then you're just going to end up with just editing material and essentially distorting what really happened. So that's why it has such a huge reputation in terms of accuracy and crucial importance.
Right, and one of the reasons why Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is so persecuted, compared to, interestingly, the Snowden documents. I remember when they first came out, Snowden and Glenn Greenwald were differentiating themselves from Chelsea Manning and saying, we just didn't do this raw dump. This is more, we're releasing it in time capsule way so that we can assess it. And yet today, a mere drop in the bucket of the Snowden docs has been released, unlike WikiLeaks.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. That is quite extraordinary. In fact, what has happened to those Snowden documents? I mean, they were released a few documents then back in 2013, and then, nothing. I mean, it's like, what's happened to them? So um, I'm not sure who exactly is, Omidyar is in control of it, or Greenwald's in control of it. I don't know. But in comparison with what we learned from WikiLeaks, we really have learned very little. I mean, we learned generally about the NSA spying, which we knew something about already before, but nonetheless, it was important. But that's
You mean
about
the
it.
Snowden docs? You meant the Snowden docs? What we've learned?
Yeah, that's not exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what we've learned from the Snowden documents. But compare that with what we've learned from WikiLeaks. I mean, you've got the Afghan War Diary, you've got the Iraq war logs, you've got the Guantanamo Bay material, and then you've got the cables, the 250,000 cables. We've got the killer video, the collateral killing video. I mean, this is a huge output. I mean, there's a material there to keep, hundreds of scholars occupied for the next 50 years. So, and I think Julian Assange himself has said that, I'm not aware of everything that we published. I mean, there's just so much material. And
Right.
so the world really, really owes a huge debt of gratitude to him.
Yes, and it goes beyond volume even. There's just a whole philosophy about
Yes.
what to release. Julian has, I would say, really put ego aside. It's not about him being the authority assessor and he has the superior insights. It's just let the people know. This transparent, just pushing out the documents for any and all to see, come what may. And that has been characterized as irresponsible. We have to do this in a more measured manner, more responsible. And so the difference, perhaps that explains why Julian Assange is far more persecuted than those who are trafficking in the Snowden docs.
I agree. I absolutely agree. Because Julian Assange says, yeah, I think the public needs to know this. That this is up to the public has to see it all. It isn't up to somehow some third party, a kind of a mediating organized group of journalists who get to decide what the public has a right to see and what it doesn't have to see. Because what will happen then is that, you get your characters in the New York Times, and you got the people in the Guardian, and they're going to start going through it, redlining everything as to what the public was. And then in the end, we won't know what we need to know. And I think that's absolutely a crucial part of his philosophy, which is let the people see what there is to see. And I all of this information is critical for every one of us. There's nothing here that somehow is threatening the security of somebody else, or if it is, it may well be threatening the security of somebody who shouldn't be doing what he was doing. So I mean, if somebody provides us with information about assassination programs, well, that's kind of, we sort of want to know about that. We don't really want to know. We don't want to give assassins a a free ticket. Yeah,
Right.
do whatever you need to do, and we'll keep your identity secret. So I mean, this is our government. These are our representatives who are doing this. This is what we need to be know about. So this idea of criticism of, oh, well, he doesn't publish anything about Russia. Yeah, because we are not Russians. He's not Russian. He's an Australian. Australia is a part of the whole kind of US-led NATO global apparat. We're living in America, living in the UK. We need to know what these people, the people who are supposedly acting on our behalf, are doing. That's the importance of it. I mean, Russians should worry about Russia. It's up to the Russians to decide what what their government is doing, and complain if necessary about whatever the Russians are doing. But the idea that, oh, well, Assange should be publishing material on Russia, and why isn't he doing it? And that somehow is proof that, I don't know, that he's working for Russia. it's ridiculous. You know, he's publishing information that we need to know. We as the citizens of the Western countries.
Right. And I do want to say that Glenn Greenwald does extraordinary work, and I very much support the excellent work he's doing. But there needs to be an inquiry into why we've just had a trickle of the Snowden docs. And kind
Yes.
of a corollary to that is, how in the world did Chelsea Manning get this pardon when Julian Assange, who didn't do anything different than kind of what Chelsea did, just put this important information out, is now being vilified? How did she? I mean, I'm happy for her, but how did that happen? And as much as I would love to go into that and hear your comments, George, we have actually reached the end of our show. And we do hope that you'll come back and maybe we can pick up some of these issues.
No, I'd very much love to. And thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be involved in this.